Has Russia reversed course in Kherson? Are they now digging in instead of retreating? Guys, it is October 26th, 2022. I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get right into it. Okay, first off, let's take a look at the tactical map. The major updates, of course, are up here in the Kharkiv front, and we can see that the only real substantial changes are some repositioning that's taken place near outside of Yampil and Lyman. And as you can see, I really think it is repositioning simply because you can see here that, as we talked about, Russia is using the terrain to its advantage. There's all these wood lines here, and these can help form natural strong points to help bolster a defensive line. So they appear to have gone from this fairly open terrain and pulled back to the much more defensible wooded areas here. You can see that, of course, Ukrainian forces are remaining, digging in and maintaining their control of sort of this major roadway here that's probably resupplying their troops that are fighting all throughout the contested or recently liberated area here. Now, when we zoom it out, right, the real story is, of course, in Kherson. And there's not officially been any additional changes in Kherson. You guys can see that the only sort of change was the 25th or 24th. And this is just a minor repositioning, again, of Russian forces, where the town of Shmitove was contested and is now in Russian hands. But this is fairly minor in the scheme of the entire thing. And we can see here that indeed the Russian forces, per the reports, are slowly, I think, being pressured against this west bank of the Dnipro, from the front lines to the Dnipro at the widest point. I think we're probably looking at, let's see, we are looking at 40 kilometers. So, definitely outside of small arms range, probably just at the edge. Like, you could have artillery units right on the bank, and you may just be able to touch the front lines with your longest range artillery. Not sure if Russia's current artillery is up to snuff for that, but I suspect that this is that there's a lot of fighting taking place, or a lot of shelling at least taking place behind the lines here. But what does that all mean? Well, what's interesting is when we go to ground.news, who, by the way, I keep a link in the description. You should definitely check them out for free. They've been a great supporter of the channel, and honestly are just a great service in this conflict, right? Because they let you see everything you need to know about a news source to make you a better, smarter consumer of the news. But a lot of sources, left, right, and center, are all reporting that, quote, the heaviest battles of Kherson, for Kherson are lying ahead. And that's what the Ukraine government is warning now, which is a really strong pivot, because a few days ago, they were saying that Russian forces are preparing to abandon Kherson without a fight. Now they're reporting that Russian forces are digging in and attempting, in an effort to defend the largest city, Kherson, or at least the largest city that Russia controls. But Russian forces are continuing their evacuation. And so it sounds like maybe these evacuation efforts, this moving of non-essential personnel and gear to rear areas, represent the fact that Russia is planning on turning this entire region that they continue to hold into a battlefield. And I think especially, as we talked about, in the actual downtown urban areas of Kherson, right, when we zoom in, we see just how incredibly dense this urban area is, right? There's a lot of territory, rail yards, warehouses, residential homes. It's going to be a ton of work for Ukrainian forces to clear this space. And I believe the Russians realize that Kherson isn't liberated until, well, Kherson itself is liberated. And if they can just maintain control of a bank, they can actually resupply. If they structure their defense correctly, they can resupply some pretty lean troops out here. If you think about the Ukrainian forces that held out at Azovstal for weeks and weeks and weeks with no resupply, except occasionally a delicate helicopter flight, right, you can understand that a defensive urban light infantry formations can really, really wreak havoc and really tie up a lot of forces. And I suspect that the Russians may have realized that this is probably the strategy, not to fight the Ukrainians in open ground, but to make their advance as punishing as possible, but not really contest the advance. And then in Kherson, turn it into a brutal slog of urban warfare, right? Try to turn it into a Stalingrad, complete with a winter. And that, I suspect, could be the Russian strategy here, to try to make its forces count for a lot more. I don't think it's incompatible with a retreat. I think Russian forces are still going to be prepared to yield a lot of ground and not necessarily consider it a tactical or operational failure to do so. And then I think their goal will be to pull Ukrainian forces into Kherson and just grind them down to such an extent that the war becomes closer to parity. That is my thesis. Of course, there are some ways the Ukrainian forces could thwart this plan. Most importantly is if they can surround Kherson and cut off this remaining bridge here, right? As we discussed, Russian forces have been evacuating civilians, so they don't plan on this being a civilian and combatant battlefield if they can avoid it. Instead, so if Ukrainian forces can simply establish a sort of siege operation, cutting off the key routes in and out of Kherson, then cutting off the ferry and bridges, and then once they control all of that, then they should be able to simply wait out these troops as they run out of food, water, and ammunition. It's a very, very vintage strategy, something that you would see, honestly, in medieval warfare. But it can be very effective, especially if the enemy's goal is to pull you into a fight you can't win. Ukrainian forces, of course, would be very wise to do so. There's a lot of territory that they can continue to attempt to revert to their control. A lot of other places they can take the fight to, and it's going to be a tall order to try to for Russia to actually achieve what they want to. Urban combat, it requires that your units have some pretty high morale and are pretty ready to go. What's interesting too is Russia's continuing to farm out its claims that Ukraine's about to use a dirty bomb. It actually said it to the UN on Tuesday. This is worrying because Russia is really trying to prepare the information space for this to happen. And even while the UN doesn't believe it, I think this is probably for Russia's internal audience for them to save face. That if this were to happen, right, Russia's going to claim, oh, we tried to alert the West and they ignored us, and then it happened, which is actually like really scary. Russia's UN ambassador said, I don't mind people saying that Russia's crying wolf if this doesn't happen, because this is a terrible, terrible disaster that threatens potentially the whole of Earth. Okay, a radioactive dirty bomb does not threaten the whole of Earth. It will threaten, it's a conventional explosive laced with radioactive material. And it doesn't really make a ton of sense because its cost of use, right, the political cost of using it, vastly outweighs its operational effectiveness. All it's going to do is make an area the size of a conventional explosive, so maybe a few 100 meters, have it have slightly elevated levels of radiation, meaning that people can't live there. But honestly, after 3 days, I suspect that soldiers with minimal gear will be able to pass through and not get much more of a dose of radiation than if they got an X-ray at a hospital. Of course, the US president said that Russia would be making an incredibly serious mistake if it used a tactical nuke. And even new British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak agreed that this cannot be tolerated. So is this a dangerous escalation by Russia? It's not clear. What is clear, though, is that major sweeping offensives, right? We may have been, at least according to the Ukrainians, patting ourselves on the back a little early for Russia's withdrawal from Kherson. Again, I maintain they're still going to withdraw, but it's going to be quite a bit more work for Ukrainian forces to liberate. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. Thank you so much for joining me. And of course, thank you to the patrons of Patreon. If you guys want access to the combat videos that YouTube just will not let me show anymore, those breakdowns are all on the Patreon. And thanks so much to my Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys really make this whole thing possible. Link to all that's in the description, and I'll see you all in the next one.